York always carried a quiet weight in the air, the kind that settles between the stones after rain. Sophie had lived there for only 3 months, long enough to learn the rhythm of its narrow lanes and the soft hum of the minster bells through her apartment window. Nothing about the city had felt strange at first. It was simply old, honest, and content to let the centuries rest where they fell. Until one morning she realized York seemed to remember her better than she remembered it. It started in a cafe tucked beneath the city walls. The barista smiled, called her by name, and asked if she wanted the usual. Sophie almost corrected him. She'd never been there before, but his familiarity was so gentle, it left her uncertain. When he handed her a latte, her initials were already written on the cup. She left with the taste of warmth and confusion, the name Sophie, bleeding slightly in the foam. Later that day, a woman at the market waved from behind a stall of flowers. "Back again?" she asked, arranging a bouquet Sophie had never bought. The scent of lilac and wet stone followed her home. York's streets wound tighter than she remembered, as if the city were closing in. Not menacingly, but like a memory replaying itself without her consent. By the end of the week, people she'd never met stopped to ask about her job, her sister, a dog she didn't own. They remembered her laugh, her voice, her favorite tea, fragments of a life that felt almost hers. Each night she stood by her window, watching the cathedral lights flicker against the mist, wondering if the city dreamed her differently than she existed. When she found her own handwriting on a note pinned to her door, "See you again soon, Sophie. You always come back." She stopped trying to explain it. York had not just welcomed her, it had recalled her. Somewhere between its centuries, the city had already lived this life once before, with her in it. Before we continue, if stories like this one pull you in, quiet mysteries hidden in the ordinary, take a moment to subscribe. Each week, we explore another fragment of time, another place that remembers differently. Now let's go back to York, and to the woman who began to realize the city was remembering her wrong. Sophie had moved to York 3 years earlier, seeking quiet. After 2 decades in London's noise, the endless schedules, the invisible weight of other people's urgency, she wanted a life that moved slower, one that could be measured in footsteps and kettle boils. York had offered that. A small apartment above an antique shop, a job cataloging rare books, and streets that looked unchanged for centuries. It was the kind of place where time felt preserved. She adapted quickly to its rhythm. The church bells at 9, the scent of wet stone after rain, the hush that followed closing hours when the tourists vanished. Her world became smaller, but gentler. The locals began to recognize her, nodding from across the market or pausing for brief chats. There was comfort in being remembered for small things. Her morning order, the scarf she always wore, the way she carried her umbrella like a walking stick. But in the weeks leading up to October, that gentle familiarity had begun to twist into something else. Faces she didn't know smiled with recognition. Conversations started mid-sentence, as if she had been there moments earlier. The shopkeeper who waved from his doorway used her name before she could offer it. None of them acted maliciously. They simply seemed convinced that Sophie had already lived the moments she was now entering for the first time. She told herself it was coincidence, a case of mistaken identity, an echo of politeness in a small city. Yet the more she tried to reason it away, the more the pattern held. These weren't strangers recalling someone who looked like her. They were remembering her specifically in scenes that had never existed. And as York's streets darkened earlier each evening, Sophie began to sense it wasn't the people who were mistaken. It was time itself, folding and unfolding, trying to decide which version of her it wanted to keep. Sophie woke before the church bells and lay still, listening to the pipes warming, the distant hum of cars on Walmgate, the gulls calling somewhere above the fog. York usually began its day like an old machine starting up, gently, predictably. But that morning, something about the sound felt uneven, like a skipped note. She tried to ignore it. Routine always restored her. Tea, scarf, umbrella, and the short walk to the bookshop near King's Square. Yet the city seemed to watch her with a kind of quiet familiarity, as if it were the one remembering her. Outside the cafe on the corner, a man smiled warmly. "You left your hat yesterday," he said, lifting a knitted beanie from his bicycle basket. Sophie frowned. "I don't own a hat." He laughed awkwardly, uncertain whether to insist or apologize. "You told me to keep it safe." His confidence unsettled her more than his mistake. She refused politely, but he left the hat on the cafe's ledge anyway, certain she'd return for it. Inside, the barista greeted her with the ease of habit. "Americano, no milk?" Sophie almost corrected her. She always ordered tea, but the girl looked so sure, so kind, that she only nodded. The cup came, bitter and black. She drank it, half hoping the warmth would anchor her to the version of reality she recognized. At the bookshop, the bell chimed its usual brass note. Mr. Atwood looked up from his ledger with relief that felt misplaced. "Glad you came back," he said. "You seemed troubled yesterday." She blinked. "Yesterday?" He turned the register toward her. 2 entries, both in his tidy handwriting, recorded her name. One before noon, one mid-afternoon. "You returned the little diary," he added. Said the date looked forged. He fetched the small leather-bound book from the shelf. Indeed, one numeral, the 5 in 1857, had been written in a newer ink. Sophie ran her finger across the page. She hadn't been there yesterday, but the correction was exactly the kind of detail she would have noticed. The familiarity frightened her. Later, a woman entered the shop, all warmth and ease. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "My sister adored the book you recommended." Sophie smiled automatically, hiding confusion. "You have a gift," the woman went on. "And your voice, it was beautiful at last week's service." Sophie froze. "Service?" "At St. Denis," the woman said, surprised. "You sing alto, don't you?" Sophie managed a polite laugh. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." The woman's smile softened with sympathy, the way people smile at those who've forgotten. "Of course," she murmured, and left with her purchase wrapped in brown paper. By noon, the dissonance had become unbearable. Sophie sat in the shop's back room with her notebook, drawing 2 columns, City's memory and mine. Under the first, she listed hat, Americano, ledger, woman's sister, choir. Under the second, tea, home yesterday, no choir, no hat. The list gave the illusion of control, but the ink seemed to tilt on the page, as if refusing to hold still. When she returned to the front, a parcel awaited her. No return address, just her name written in a careful hand. The postman waved from the door. "You said it was urgent," he called, glad it arrived. Sophie sliced the paper with the shop knife. Inside, a framed photograph rested in folded cloth. The scent of damp linen rose like breath. The photo showed a choir standing on church steps in winter. The date at the bottom read, St. Denis Advent Service last year. There, third from the left, was a woman identical to Sophie. Same gray eyes, same half-smile, wearing a navy coat and a red scarf she'd never owned. On the back of the frame, a note, as promised. "We'll see you Sunday." MP Mr. Atwood studied it too long. "That's St. Denis, all right," he said. "And that does look like you." He hesitated. "Perhaps there's someone in town who resembles you." Sophie wanted to agree, to fold the world back into reason. But the resemblance wasn't partial. It was exact, down to the small crescent scar on her knuckle. She wrapped the photo again, telling herself she'd visit the church that evening, not Sunday. Whatever this confusion was, it felt recent, like a tear that hadn't yet healed. Outside, York was steeped in mist. The streets seemed to move around her instead of the other way. At the corner of Colliergate, a middle-aged woman waved. "Sophie, I found your note. Should I still bring the black folder on Sunday?" Sophie stopped. "I didn't leave a note." The woman blinked kindly. "Oh, you forget things when you're tired. See you soon." And then she was gone, her figure dissolving into fog like a memory leaving before it could be questioned. That night, Sophie placed the framed photo on her mantel. The firelight flickered across the glass. The image was ordinary. No blur, no impossible light, just a group of singers, the faint breath of winter visible around them. She lifted her phone to take a picture, aligning the frame within the screen. For a second, the focus wavered. When it settled, the reflection of her own face hovered beside the one in the photo. And in that instant, she saw the woman, her double, turning slightly toward her, eyes aimed not at the unseen conductor, but out of the photograph. Sophie lowered the phone. The choir remained frozen, unchanged, yet the angle of that gaze lingered like heat. She covered the frame with its cloth and turned it to face the wall, her pulse unsteady but her hands deliberate. Then she opened her notebook and wrote beneath City's memory, photograph, Face moved when seen without lens. Under mine. Never sang at St. Denis. No red scarf. No note left. She paused before closing it, as though the act might erase her own certainty. Outside, the bells of York Minster tolled 6, slightly out of rhythm with their echo. Sophie put on her coat. If the city had learned to remember her incorrectly, perhaps it could be reminded of the truth. She slipped the umbrella through her arm, pocketed the note from the back of the frame, and stepped into the fog. The air tasted metallic, and for the briefest moment she thought she heard her own voice. Distant, familiar, singing somewhere down the street, carried on a wind that didn't belong to this hour. Sophie reached St. Denis as the evening fog thickened into a pale curtain around the church's stone tower. The old building looked older in the half-light, walls patched from centuries of repair, stained glass glowing faintly behind iron lattice. She hadn't planned what she would say if anyone was inside. She only knew she needed to stand there in front of the place that seemed to remember her more vividly than she remembered herself. The wooden door gave a long, reluctant sigh when she pushed it open. Inside, the air was dense with the smell of wax and cold stone. Someone had left the lights over the altar burning low. Rows of hymn books rested on the pews, each one closed neatly, as if waiting. Sophie walked slowly down the aisle, the soles of her boots whispering against the worn floor. The quiet didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, like the faint hum after a conversation ends, but the words still hang in the air. Near the choir stalls, she found a small notice board covered with faded photographs of Christmas services and summer fairs. There it was again, the choir photo. Same composition, same winter coats. She leaned closer and saw her own face more clearly than in the framed version. The same expression, the same red scarf. A tiny label beneath the picture read, Advent Service 2022, Choir Volunteers. Her name appeared in neat type under the third face from the left, Sophie Hale. Her stomach tightened. The name was right. Everything else was wrong. She had moved to York in 2021, but she had never volunteered here, never even stepped inside until tonight. She touched the corner of the photograph. The paper felt warm, as though recently held. Footsteps sounded behind her. Slow, confident, familiar. Sophie turned quickly. A man in a dark coat stood by the doorway, silhouetted against the weak streetlight behind him. His features were hard to make out, but his voice was easy, practiced. "You came early," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd get my note." Sophie froze. "You're MP?" He nodded once, stepping closer. "Matthew Price. We spoke after rehearsal, remember? You said you'd think about rejoining." She shook her head. "We've never met." He smiled, not unkindly, but as if correcting a child. "You've said that before." Then, as her silence stretched, "You don't have to be afraid. Sometimes the city forgets. It always does." Sophie took a step back. "The city forgets?" He tilted his head, studying her. "Or maybe it's you who does. It happens to the ones caught between." The words landed like cold water. She wanted to demand explanation, but something about his tone made argument seem childish. Instead, she asked softly, "Caught between what?" He gestured toward the choir stalls. "Memory and correction. The city keeps both." For a long moment, they just stood there, Sophie and the man who spoke as if reading from a script she didn't remember performing. Then he turned away, moving toward the door that led to the vestry. "It'll make sense after Sunday," he said. "You'll see." By the time she followed, the door had stopped swinging. Only the faint echo of his shoes remained. She found herself staring at the dust on the threshold, untouched. Outside, night had fully arrived. The fog muted every color until the world seemed drained of temperature. Sophie walked quickly, clutching her coat closed. When she reached her building, she saw the window of her flat already lit. A mistake, she thought, until she remembered she hadn't left any lamps on. Upstairs, the air was warmer than she expected. The scent of lemon oil from the antique shop below usually lingered faintly, but now it was stronger, fresher, as though someone had recently dusted the furniture. On the small table near the door sat a mug of tea, her favorite blend, still steaming. Beside it lay her notebook, open to the last page she had written. The new entry wasn't hers. In the same handwriting, beneath her own notes, someone had added, "You're close. Don't undo it." MP Sophie's pulse quickened. She went room to room, switching on lights, searching for any sign of intrusion. Nothing was out of place, not even the folded cloth that covered the photograph on the mantel. She lifted it carefully. The frame was cool, untouched. The woman inside the picture, herself, still faced forward. She stared at the note again, the 3 letters at the bottom looking more like initials carved into time than ink on paper. She wanted to tear the page out, but some part of her feared removing it would erase something larger than her notebook. Instead, she took a photograph with her phone, proof for later, proof for someone. Sleep came reluctantly. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the inside of St. Denis, its quiet hum, the warmth of the photo on the wall. Just before dawn, she dreamed, or believed she did, that she was standing again among the choir. The church was full of winter breath and candle smoke. The conductor lifted his hand, and the first note rose like mist. Her own voice joined, though she didn't remember knowing the melody. When she woke, the last chord still rang faintly in her ears. At work the next morning, Mr. Atwood noticed the circles under her eyes. "You all right?" he asked. Sophie hesitated. "Do you ever feel like York remembers things that didn't happen?" He chuckled softly. "That's history for you." Then, seeing her expression, his smile faded. "Maybe you need rest, not questions." Rest was impossible. Each customer who came through the door seemed to know her slightly too well. A man thanked her for recommending a poetry collection she'd never read. A girl asked if the antique locket had arrived yet, the one Sophie had supposedly ordered for her mother. Each detail nested neatly inside the next, a pattern repeating with unsettling precision. At noon, she found herself walking again, as if pulled by the city's own gravity. The streets were crowded now, but everyone seemed to move with purpose, avoiding her without seeing her. When she passed the cafe, the same knitted hat still rested on the chalkboard ledge, untouched and dry despite the drizzle. She slipped it into her bag without knowing why. The bells tolled 1. Across the square, she saw Matthew Price standing by the church railings, speaking to a group of parish volunteers. He caught her eye and smiled faintly, a recognition too assured to be coincidence. She approached, but before she could speak, he turned to the others and said, "See, I told you she'd remember the way." The group looked over, polite but unsurprised, as though this meeting were scheduled long ago. Sophie's voice came out smaller than she meant. "You keep saying I've been here before." "Because you have," Matthew said. "Twice, maybe more. You always come when the line thins. You just forget after it closes." She didn't understand. "What line?" He studied her face with something like pity. "Between the living city and the remembered one. Most people walk through only once." He turned back toward the church gate, gesturing for her to follow. "Come on, it's better to see than to be told." Sophie hesitated, but the quiet around her shifted, as if the air itself expected her to move. She followed him through the gate and into the courtyard where the choir photograph had been taken. The mist had cleared slightly. Faint sunlight spilled through and touched the steps. "Do you see?" Matthew asked. The steps were empty, until they weren't. A shimmer of light, like heat above asphalt, flickered across the stones. Figures appeared, forming slowly from the brightness. People in winter coats, some laughing, some adjusting sheet music. The choir, the same as the photograph. They stood perfectly still for a heartbeat, then turned as one toward her. Sophie backed away, breath caught in her throat. Her double stood among them, expression calm, eyes steady. The red scarf looked vivid against the gray. Matthew's voice was low beside her ear. "That's the city's memory," he said. "And now it remembers you twice." The vision dissolved with the next blink. The steps were bare again, wet from drizzle. Sophie looked for Matthew, but he was gone. Only the faint echo of a hymn drifted from nowhere, soft and thin, like something recalled from another life. When she returned home, her notebook lay open on the table again. A new line had been written beneath the others. "St. Denis Steps. The echo will not fade." The handwriting was hers. Sophie sat down slowly, staring at the words. For the first time, she wasn't sure whether she had written them or only remembered doing so. Outside, the city's bells began to ring. The sound slightly delayed, as if answering from another version of York still trying to decide which of her belonged there. Sophie woke to a city that sounded slightly out of sync with itself. The kettle took longer to boil. The church bells rang a heartbeat late, and her reflection in the window lagged half a blink behind. She stared at her notebook lying open on the table. The last words written in a hand identical to hers. "St. Denis Steps. The echo will not fade." She needed evidence that didn't breathe or remember. So she walked to the city library on Museum Street. where time had always felt orderly. The clerk at the desk greeted her as though she'd arrived for an appointment. "Back for the parish files?" Sophie answered yes, before realizing she shouldn't know what that meant. The clerk led her to a gray archival box labeled St. Denis, Choir and Events, 2021-2023. Inside, among typed rosters and donation forms, she found it. Hale, Sophie, alto, neatly listed under Advent 2022. On the back of a hymn sheet, a pencil note curved across the margin. "Remember rests in bar 12, SH." The initials were hers. The handwriting was hers. Her phone camera trembled as she photographed it. The quiet around her seemed to wait for something to be decided. When she looked up, an elderly man across the table nodded at her. "Good voice you have. Sang beautifully last year." "I didn't," she said, but even as she spoke, the denial felt thin. Outside, the cold hit like truth. The bells of York Minster rang again, their echo arriving fractionally late, like a sound traveling from another version of the city. She crossed King's Square and nearly collided with a man standing in her path. Tall, coat collar turned up, eyes steady. "You came early," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd get my note." "Matthew Price," she murmured, remembering the initials from the photograph. He smiled faintly. "You remember now." "I remember reading your name," she corrected. "That's different." He tilted his head, studying her with a kind of weary patience. "You said that before." "Before what?" "Before you forgot." The street fell quiet around them, as if waiting for her next question. "What is happening to me?" He looked past her toward the minster. "It isn't happening to you. It's happening through you. York doesn't like gaps in its memory. You filled one once. Now it's trying to keep you there. I don't understand." "You will. Come tonight, 6:30. St. Denis Vestry." And then he was gone, swallowed by a turn in the street that shouldn't have hidden anyone so quickly. That afternoon, Sophie worked at the bookshop, but remembered little of it. Mr. Atwood's questions blurred into the low hum of customers. By closing, she'd made her decision. If the city was remembering her wrongly, she'd face the memory head on. The walk to St. Denis felt heavier than distance. The fog pressed close, the street lamps glowing like coins at the bottom of a pond. The church door was unlocked, as if expecting her. Inside, faint voices carried from the vestry, warm, practiced, unconcerned. A woman turned at the sound of Sophie's steps. "There you are," she said with gentle certainty. "Mara, we spoke on the phone." Sophie hesitated. "I don't think—" But the woman handed her a black folder. Inside lay sheet music marked in pencil. Bar 12. Rest. Breathe before ascent. The same handwriting. "You'll remember as you sing," Mara said softly. Sophie followed her into the choir stalls, the air cool and faintly scented with wax. Matthew Price stood at the front beside an electric keyboard. He gave a brief nod, neither welcoming nor commanding. "We'll start easy," he said. The first chord trembled through the nave. Sopranos entered. Altos followed. Sophie's throat tightened, but muscle memory, hers or someone else's, found the note. The sound came out clear. It startled her enough to nearly break the line. She pressed on. When they reached bar 12, her mouth closed instinctively, a rest so precise it frightened her. The next note lifted as if the air had been waiting for her to rejoin it. For a moment she felt something shift, not in the room, but beneath it, as though the city itself exhaled. When the hymn ended, silence fell with a delicate weight. Matthew lowered his hands. "See?" he said quietly. The line held. Sophie's heart raced. "What line?" He looked at her with a kind of pity she'd already learned to resent. Between what's remembered and what's still happening. He began collecting the sheets, signaling the end of rehearsal. The others chatted softly, laughter echoing against stone. Sophie slipped outside before anyone could stop her. The night air tasted of iron. Across the courtyard, the church's notice board gleamed with condensation. A photograph had been pinned to the center, the same choir image she'd seen before. But this time, her reflection in the glass overlapped perfectly with the face in the picture. For an instant, they aligned so precisely that she couldn't tell which belonged to her. She stepped back. The glass fogged, blurring both images. When it cleared, the woman in the photo, her double, appeared to be looking slightly downward, as if aware of the alignment just missed. Sophie's stomach tightened. She turned and walked quickly home. Her flat was dark except for the faint glow from the street outside. On the mantel, the photograph still faced the room, unchanged. She set the choir folder beside it, then opened her notebook. Under City's memory, she wrote, "Library records, Advent roster, rehearsal tonight, bar 12 rest correct." Under mine, she wrote, "Moved to York 2021. Never sang before. No memory of choir." She closed the notebook halfway, then opened it again, uncertain which version she wanted to keep. The air seemed thicker, like the pause between two notes of the same song. She picked up the knitted hat, the one the stranger had sworn was hers, and placed it gently on the table, next to the open notebook. It looked like a signature at the end of a sentence she hadn't meant to write. Outside, the bells of the minster began again, their rhythm delayed by half a beat. Sophie stood by the window, watching the city lights waver through the mist. Somewhere in the distance, faintly muffled by fog and walls, she heard a choir practicing the same hymn she'd just sung. It wasn't the sound that frightened her. It was the recognition, the way the second verse entered exactly as she whispered the words under her breath. The two voices, hers and theirs, matched perfectly for one measure before falling slightly out of sync. The city, it seemed, was still adjusting. Sophie closed her eyes and listened as the echoes folded over each other, uncertain which belonged to memory and which belonged to now. And for the first time, she wasn't sure it mattered. Sophie woke to rain drumming softly against the windows. The air smelled faintly metallic, like stone after lightning. Her notebook lay open on the table where she'd left it. In the gray morning light, the ink looked darker, fresher, as if someone had written in it overnight. She leaned closer. Beneath her last entry, "I am learning the city's memory faster than it is learning mine," a new line had appeared, written in her own precise handwriting. Then stop learning. She dropped the pen she hadn't picked up. The sound it made against the table seemed too loud, echoing for half a second longer than it should have. Her first thought was that she'd written it in her sleep. Her second was worse, that she hadn't. She dressed quickly, unable to stand still in the flat. The morning felt stretched thin, like a film of water about to tear. When she stepped outside, the rain had already stopped, but the streets remained slick and shining. York looked freshly made, as if the city had been rewritten overnight and hadn't yet dried. She found herself walking toward the river, where reflections always looked truer than the things they mirrored. From the bridge, she saw the buildings ripple softly with each movement of the water. Somewhere below, the minster bells struck 9, again, slightly late. Sophie pulled the choir folder from her bag. It had stayed with her since the rehearsal. Inside, the sheet music seemed different, the pencil marks thicker, the page darker around the edges. In the margin, beside bar 12, another note had appeared in faint graphite. "You're remembering too much." She stared until her eyes burned. Then she tore the page free and let it drift into the river. It didn't sink. It floated, spinning slowly, until it passed under the bridge and vanished. At the bookshop, Mr. Atwood greeted her as if nothing had changed. He spoke cheerfully about a shipment of poetry books, though his eyes looked tired, unfocused. "Odd thing," he said. "I thought you were here earlier. Heard you moving about." "I wasn't," Sophie said automatically. He nodded, unconcerned. "You said that last time, too." The register was already open to a fresh page. Her name was written at the top, in his handwriting, not hers. "Hale, Sophie. Inventory check, 9:15. The time was precise. She looked at her watch. 9:15 exactly. Her pulse jumped. She tore the page from the ledger before he could stop her. "Something wrong?" he asked gently. Sophie folded the paper. "No, just correcting an error." She left before he could reply. By late morning, the city had grown busier, but the crowd moved strangely. People walked in deliberate lines, as if following choreography only they could see. At King's Square, a woman brushing past her murmured, "Morning again, Sophie," though her face was unfamiliar. Two schoolchildren waved from across the street and then froze, confused, as if realizing they shouldn't know her. Sophie crossed to the cafe, seeking something stable. The smell of roasted beans and sugar usually grounded her. But today, Lila wasn't behind the counter. Another barista, a young man she had never seen, smiled and asked, "The usual?" Sophie hesitated. "You mean tea?" He looked puzzled. "You changed to Americano last month." The line behind her rustled impatiently. She nodded and accepted the cup. The first sip was bitter, metallic. She checked her reflection in the window and saw herself raise the cup a fraction later than she felt the motion. She left the cafe quickly, unable to bear the dissonance. At noon, she sat on a bench near the shambles, watching people pass. The city no longer felt layered like history. It felt looped. Conversations repeated faintly as echoes, not perfectly aligned. She heard her own name once, then twice. One voice close, one further off, overlapping like a delayed recording. She pressed her palms together and whispered, "What do you want from me?" A man sitting several benches away, older, wearing a brown overcoat, turned his head slightly. "Consistency," he said. The word hit her like a cold wind. She stood, ready to demand who he was, but he was already walking away, blending into the crowd. In the afternoon, she went to the library again. The clerk was gone. The desk was empty. The reading room lights flickered faintly overhead, buzzing in time with her pulse. The archival box she'd examined before now sat open on the table, though she hadn't requested it. A single page lay on top, the same choir roster. But the text had changed. Where it had once read, "Hail, Sophie, alto," it now said, "Hail, Sophie, retained." She ran a hand through her hair. "What does that mean?" she whispered aloud. The overhead lights flickered again, slower this time, almost deliberate. When they steadied, she noticed something on the inside of the box lid, faint handwriting in pencil. "It means you stayed." She pushed the box away so sharply it skidded off the table and hit the floor with a hollow thud. Outside, the daylight had already begun to fade. She walked without direction until the Minster bells started again. Their echo overlapped oddly, as if two versions of the city were ringing at once. Each tone arrived a fraction later than the last, a widening seam in time. By instinct, she found herself heading back toward St. Denis. The church door stood open, though no light burned inside. The air smelled of rain and wax. She stepped in cautiously, her footsteps sounding too loud against the stone. In the choir stalls, the hymn folders were already arranged. She opened one at random. The sheet inside was blank except for a single phrase written across the center in careful ink. "Stop remembering. Let us keep it." Her throat tightened. "Who are you?" she said to the empty air. A voice answered from the darkened vestry. "You know who we are." Matthew Price stepped forward, face pale in the half-light. "You weren't meant to interfere," he said quietly. Sophie took a step back. "You said the city needed consistency." "It does." He studied her as though she were a problem being solved in real time. "York remembers everything that ever happened to it, but sometimes it remembers too much. The same souls replay. The same paths overlap. You started remembering both versions." "And what happens if I stop?" she asked. He hesitated. "Then one of you will fade." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Which one?" He didn't answer. Sophie turned to leave, but the heavy door refused to open. The latch moved, but the door stayed shut, as if the air itself held it closed. Behind her, Matthew's footsteps approached slowly. "You should rest," he said. "We'll remember the rest for you." She pressed her forehead against the cold wood, fighting panic. "I'm real," she said. "I live here. I work here." "You worked here," he corrected gently. "You moved here 3 years ago. You sang that winter. The city kept the version it liked best." She spun around. "Then what am I?" "An echo that learned to ask questions." The candles along the altar flickered, casting long shadows that moved independent of their flames. Sophie backed toward the center aisle. "I won't let you rewrite me." Matthew's expression softened. "You already did." He lifted a hand, not threatening, just final, and the air seemed to compress. The sound around her dimmed until she could hear her own pulse, quick and small. For a moment, the church blurred at the edges, like a photograph before focus. Then, suddenly, she was outside. The door behind her was closed, and the lights inside burned steadily, as if nothing had happened. The rain had stopped again. The street was empty. When she reached her flat, the hallway lights flickered. On her table, the notebook waited, open to a clean page. Her handwriting covered it in looping black ink she didn't remember writing. December 3rd, I attended rehearsal. I sang well. I feel peaceful now. The date was next week. She tore out the page and dropped it into the waste bin. The next page beneath was also filled. Another entry, identical except for the date. December 10th. I attended rehearsal. I sang well. She tore that one out too. More pages followed, dozens of them stretching weeks, months, each line documenting a life she hadn't lived yet. Attended rehearsal, sang alto, city quiet tonight. At the very end of the notebook, one final page stood blank except for a single sentence written in large, steady letters. You will stop fighting soon. The city always remembers what it needs. Sophie dropped the book. Her breath came fast, shallow. She looked around the room, the same walls, same furniture, but everything felt arranged slightly differently, as though she'd returned to a replica made from memory. The clock on the wall ticked once, then again, but no seconds passed between the sounds. Outside, the bells began to ring. This time, there was no delay between them, no echo, no split in rhythm. Just one steady sound, perfect and complete. Sophie closed her eyes and whispered, then let it remember. The bells went on ringing, clear and synchronized, as York settled into whichever version of itself had finally decided to keep her. Morning arrived exact. The bells struck without lag, the kettle boiled on cue. Her reflection matched her blink. Sophie stood in her doorway and felt a thin dread at the smoothness of it. Correctness had replaced strangeness like plaster over a crack. She left the notebook closed. On Fossgate, the city behaved. A lorry idled, a cyclist lifted a hand, a child tugged a sleeve. Everything clicked. At the bookshop, the bell chimed cleanly. Mr. Atwood smiled with a steadiness that seemed newly practiced. Inventory today. You penciled your hours yesterday. He turned the ledger. Her name filled the week ahead. Choir was written beside Wednesday in a neat hand, not his. Did I? She asked. You did, he said gently. Are you steady, Sophie? She nodded and carried a crate to the back, lemon oil folded around her like a polite argument. She shelved books and let her hands do competence while her mind walked the seams of the day, searching for give. At 10, a woman entered with a paper bag. You dropped this, she said, setting a folded red scarf on the counter. The knit was simple, a loose thread caught beneath Sophie's thumb with familiar insistence. I've never owned this, Sophie said. It looks like you, the woman replied, and left. The scarf sat where the city placed it, patient as a laid-out costume. At lunch, Sophie put the scarf and her notebook in her bag and walked to the river. Beside a run of Roman wall, older than everything else, she pressed her palm to stone. If anything is older than your memory, she said to the wall, hold mine. She tore a page, the kind that foretold. Across the printed future she wrote, if you find this, you are me. Choose a word the city will never expect. She considered the city's appetite, churches, ledgers, bells, winter, then printed a word with no business in York's files, avocado. She folded the page and pushed it deep into a fissure until it disappeared. Briefly breathless, as if she had wedged a piece of herself into the wall, she wrapped the red scarf, not to agree with the city but to carry the evidence of it. On St. Saviour Gate she nearly collided with Matthew Price. You look better, he said. Everything's on time, she answered. Consistency is merciful after a tear. His eyes dipped to the scarf. It suits you. It suits the version you're keeping, she said. There isn't malice in it. There's subtraction. That's another way of saying mercy. For whom? He didn't say. Traffic moved around them, politely ignoring their small gravity. Do you remember the other version of me? She asked. I remember you left once, he said. By the sea. You came back and sang through winter. York filed you under return. How do you know? I left too. The admission unsteadied him. He stepped back. Be careful what you anchor. He was gone before she could ask more. The afternoon passed in an envelope of normal. Sales, thank yous, a book fetched from the back. At 4, she closed early and walked to St. Denis. The vestry smelled of paper and polish. On the table lay fresh Advent copies, stamped with a date 2 weeks away. Across the top, someone had written, Retained order, do not alter. She slid one into her folder and went to the porch. The choir photograph held its winter breath. She lifted her phone. For a heartbeat, the reflection of her face aligned with the faces, then slid a fraction aside. I need another proof, she said, and the porch made a room of it. That night she returned to the shop after closing. Under a low shelf, a thin gap waited. On a receipt she wrote, If anyone finds this, ask Sophie for the word. She added the word, folded the paper, and pushed it into the seam until it was gone. As she straightened, the front bell sounded though no one stood at the door. The ring hung like glass, cooling. She walked home along the wall. In her flat, the photograph waited with its poise. She set the scarf beside it and said, "Tomorrow," though she meant the city. Sleep brought not a story, but a place. Under York, stone and coolness, and a taut thread drawn from her hand to hers. Waking, she spoke the word aloud to hear if the day would take it. It did not. Morning was still exact. She dressed and tied the scarf without thinking. At the shop door, the bell chimed. From the back, Mr. Atwood called, "Tell Mara I found the missing folder." At the counter, a tourist turned a postcard rack. "Any books on the Roman road under here?" she asked. Sophie led her to local history. The woman chose a guide, then lowered her voice. "Odd question. I found a receipt under the back shelf." She unfolded a creased slip. "It says to ask you for the word. Is this a treasure hunt?" Sophie took the paper. Her handwriting waited, faint and smudged. The room seemed to lean. "What's the word?" the woman asked, amused. "Avocado," Sophie said. The tourist laughed softly. "That's it? Excellent." She slid the receipt into the guide and paid. The bell chimed as she left. Alone again, Sophie stood very still. Something in the room aligned by a hair, the way a frame feels when it's finally straight. She opened her notebook for the first time in 2 days. The page was blank. She wrote, "Today the city remembered me saying a word it didn't expect." She waited. No second line wrote itself. In the afternoon, Mara arrived with music. "We're changing the psalm," she said. "Matthew wants a softer cadence." She tapped a small symbol penciled above a rest. "What's that?" Sophie asked. His reminder. "Don't fill the gap. Let it be a gap." After she left, Sophie copied the symbol into her notebook and boxed it. Evening lifted the edges of the day. She closed the shop and walked home the long way, pausing once more at the Roman wall. The crack where she'd hidden the page looked empty. Perhaps rain had taken it. Perhaps the city had found it. At her flat, she lifted the cloth from the choir photograph. The woman in the red scarf faced forward, unchanged. Sophie turned the frame over. The sticky note that had promised Sunday was gone. In its place, a smaller square of paper had been tucked under the prongs. 3 letters in the careful hand she recognized. MP beneath, a single word. Neither his nor hers. A third that looked like both. "Keep." Sophie set the frame down and sat at the table. She wrote, "The city prefers consistency. I prefer gaps that are mine." Beside the sentence, she drew the little rest again and printed the ordinary word that had not belonged here until she made it belong. Night came on true. The bells rang on time. The echo arrived with them, not after. She listened until the sound thinned into evening. When it had gone, a quieter note remained. The silence after a rest, the one a song needs to be itself. She let that silence keep her. The days that followed settled into something quiet, something careful. York had evened itself out again. The bells rang precisely. The cafe brewed the same tea each morning. And people's eyes no longer lingered on Sophie as if testing which version of her they'd met before. Sometimes she wondered if the city had chosen a memory at last, and if she was living inside it, or merely being remembered by it. She no longer kept the notebook open on her table. It sat closed, its edges pale from handling, like a book that had forgotten it once belonged to a reader. When she passed St. Denis, she didn't look through the church gate. The photograph had likely been taken down, replaced by another winter's faces. Still, she could almost hear the choir practicing on cold nights, the same melody looping through time, soft as breath, familiar as regret. At home, the red scarf hung on the back of her chair. Some evenings she thought of removing it, of undoing the city's small claim on her, but she never did. The threads had warmed to her touch, as though they'd been waiting to remember her again. One night, walking home through Fossgate, she heard someone humming ahead of her, the same tune from that winter service. The sound moved through fog like a lantern's glow. When she turned the corner, the street was empty. Yet the humming continued, low and steady, fading only when she whispered the single word she'd given the city, the word it could never expect. And just like that, the echo broke. York fell silent. But for a long while afterward, when the bells rang each morning, they sounded almost like her name.